tell us about yourself, Brian.
Well, it's kind of funny in a way. This is a homecoming. I mean, I didn't work in this building, but in '93, I started working as kind of a volunteer, and then eventually they started paying me, and then I joined as an employee at Wired magazine, employee number 27-ish. And their first office was at the corner of 2nd and South Park in the brick building that Blue Bottle Coffee is in. And I got this job partly because so I'd started a rave mailing list called SF Raves, kind of on a server, a Unix server sitting at Berkeley, where I was an undergraduate. I started going there in '91, and I was into electronic music, rave music, that sort of thing, and kind of being, being new to the Bay Area, I was like, it's got to be out there somewhere. But aside from like nightclubs, which were 21 and over, and not having or wanting to get a fake ID, I was like, there must be something else. And I started to find flyers in record stores like BPM and others that don't exist anymore, talking about kind of parties on beaches and full moon raves and things like that. And I was like, somebody's got to know where these are. So I started this mailing list, and even in '92, early '92 when that started, having a few hundred people on a mailing list was like big time, right? It was kind of like, there were Usenet groups and things like that, but that was kind of fun. It like connected me outside the school to the broader Bay Area community of technologists. I mean, that was a time when if you got an email from somebody you had never met before, you were like, wow, you know email too? You must be cool. You wanted that, right? It was exciting to even if they were just, the next street over, but then to realize you just as easily could be talking to somebody in Russia or Europe or something like that, was pretty awesome. So somebody I knew from that mailing list, a guy named Jonathan Stoyer, who I saw at a Psychic TV concert on Halloween while he was dressed as a Catholic schoolgirl, said, hey, I'm working at this new publication called Wired, and we are starting to play with this online stuff, and we want to kind of put the magazine online for whatever that means. They had like an AOL presence, but kind of nothing beyond that. So started working there, and over the course of about 9 months, put not only the back issues of the magazine online in kind of black text on a white background, kind of feeling like I was doing God's work in a way, because the text was sometimes hard to read in the magazine because it was like pink text on a purple background, right? I loved the graphic design, but there was really important content in the early days of Wired that I felt was important to get out. And so after a little while, though, we realized, well, maybe this should like pay for itself in some way. What could we do? Well, maybe we'd have kind of portions of a page that would have like a message, maybe a banner of some sort from a company. Maybe we can talk the existing advertisers in Wired into also paying money in this space. How many viewers are we getting, or how many people are looking at these pages? Oh, a couple hundred a day. Oh, that's going to be hard to sell, but everyone wants to be cutting edge. Why don't we do that? So we launched something called Hot Wired, which was the first real kind of unique content. It was one of the first 100 or so non-academic websites on the internet, and it was the first ad-supported website. And so I guess I put the first ad banner online, and I've been apologizing for it ever since. I also helped play a role in defining the cookie, for which I've also apologized. But I didn't think people would combine the two and lead us to the surveillance dystopia we have today. That's another story. I did a couple other things, started another company called CollabNet. Again, our offices were just around the corner at Bryant, kind of halfway between 2nd and 3rd. Wired moved to the 510 3rd Street, and while working at Wired during the day, moonlighting, starting a company called Organic at night that built some of the first sites for Harley Davidson, Levi's, Nike, that sort of thing. So played a lot around here, and then kind of moved out in 2001. CollabNet kind of grew. We had to take a space kind of further down the peninsula. But all that time, kind of the web was built from what was, even before it was called open source software, from open source software, right? The reason we had email and Usenet News and DNS and HTTP was because people building this stuff, to prove that it worked, would just share the code with each other. Like there wasn't a proprietary interest in it so much. And even though there were like proprietary operating systems, like all of the networking layer was open source. And so improving this web server software built by NCSA, this group at the University of Illinois, who also built Mosaic, improving that, adding hacks to it, and when all those people got hired away by a company called Netscape that was starting up, going, well, we could continue this forward ourselves. That became the Apache web server project. And all of this was kind of like, there was always like the day job and then the night job, right? And in some ways they justified each other. Certainly at Organic, we played up the notion that, we're involved in the development of Apache and that's why you should hire us to build your website for you, right? Some of it was kind of justification in reverse, but some of it was like a compelling sale. And that, what motivated me, what got me up in the morning wasn't like helping Harley Davidson sell motorcycles. It was like feeling like the sense of being on this frontier. Maybe there hadn't been a frontier since like the West was, civilized or something, and the internet definitely felt like a frontier at that point. So you just wanted to like run out and embrace it, right? And do that in a way that created a lot of value and maybe would help us pay rent in San Francisco and such. There wasn't quite the big $ exits kind of like in that time, but there was that sense of this could be a liberating thing for everybody, right? This could be something that helped. I mean, it felt like it was hard to communicate back then. It was hard to like not only meet somebody in Finland or whatever, but like hard to find basic information, hard to like, help underrepresented voices be heard. And so it did feel at the time, and I know it doesn't feel that way anymore so much, but it did feel at the time that like getting people more connected, giving everybody not just a printing press but a megaphone felt like a moral imperative, right? And in retrospect, it seems a little quaint, but we can talk more about that, right? But certainly at the time, it felt like it was worth doing. So I've done other things since then, but like what brought me here obviously has its seeds in that, and I don't know. I've been talking for a lot, so we can talk more about what kind of later stuff I did. Do you want me to talk about what I do now?
Yeah, for sure. I think it's super interesting. I'm sure South Park in this neighborhood looked very different at that time.
Yeah, there wasn't quite like the rope kind of whatever, like the play structure out there in the field. It was like just a bare stretch of dirt out there with occasional like tufts of grass. But Cafe Centro was there, South Park Cafe was there, the Taqueria even was there. Like there was, and there were like CD-ROM authoring companies, around here, and like Adobe, no, Macromedia, right, had like a big office kind of over that way a few blocks. So there was the beginnings of that, and in some ways San Francisco has always had this kind of like rebel spirit, this kind of nonconformist kind of streak, whether it was like the Baghdad by the Bay in the 1850s and 60s to the Beat generation in the 1950s, and obviously the 60s and disco in the 70s or something like that. Like, and in the 1980s, the HIV crisis here too, and but also the sense that this is a place where it was okay to be gay or lesbian. Like San Francisco attracted the nonconformists. It attracted the people who had a passion about a different way to do something and gave them the freedom to do it. And we felt like we were plugging into that, where we were connecting and carrying that forward in a big way. And we weren't there to do it, to make tons of money. We were there to kind of advance something, right? So anyways.
Yeah, okay, so I think we are getting a good sense of what like early Brian was like. So what do you do now? Okay,
so went through a few detours. After CollabNet, where I kind of like was a little bit exhausted by the startup grind, and CollabNet's still around, it kind of plateaued. It was never a big exit for anybody who was involved in starting it. But I decided to volunteer in the Obama campaign, and then I worked in the Obama White House for 2 years in the Office of Science and Tech Policy, commuting between San Francisco and there. That commute started to drag on me, and I didn't want to build a career in DC, so I decided to take a job in Geneva, Switzerland, doing basically the same thing, but worked there as the CTO for the World Economic Forum for 2 years, and can talk a lot more about that. There's something to not being locked into a career or not being locked in a job that gives you the freedom to be able to speak truth to power, to be able to be more disruptive, if you will, or push forward on things that you think are the right thing to do. It can sometimes be a career limiting move too. Spent 2 years there and then came back here and not knowing what I wanted to do next, but having a friend who was starting a VC firm, worked at a VC firm called Mithril for a couple of years. As all this kind of cryptocurrency stuff and Bitcoin stuff and blockchain stuff started to explode in 2014 and 2015, was following it but pretty skeptical, just because it looked like a young technology that was all about decentralizing, all about getting to some degree back to that idyllic day of an internet where people kind of had their nodes on their homesteads on this frontier, right? But I saw what felt like it being corrupted very early on in its age by a mad rush to printing money out of thin air, and good people operating, but also in many places allowing themselves to be taken advantage of. And then heard an announcement from something the Linux Foundation was launching called Hyperledger. And after scratching the surface of that and actually going to a couple of their kind of technical gatherings, realized that here is where people were working on kind of how do you usefully decentralize, how do you usefully try to, still recognize there's a role for human governance and human cooperation and connection in building decentralized systems. And there was a lot of hard work at a technology layer to have to build. And it wasn't going to look like an operating system or a web server. It was going to be a collection of a lot of different tools. And I went to Jim Zemlin, who runs the Linux Foundation, I've known for a while, and said, can I help in some way? And he's like, we're looking for an executive director. So since June of 2016, I've been leading the Hyperledger project at the Linux Foundation, it's a nonprofit. We are, but not a charity. We're more of a industry consortium. So I have about 250 different companies 250 different organizations, about 190 of which are for-profit companies that pay a membership fee. The other 60 are nonprofits or government agencies or central banks and others who don't pay money but still have some technical contribution they're making or otherwise. And so that effort funds kind of essentially an air traffic control team, myself and people who help grow the technical communities and people who look after the member communities, help them get some value. But this whole thing is about how do we build something that can do for the blockchain space what Linux and FreeBSD and other open source operating systems did for operating systems, what Kubernetes has done for cloud containers, right? What seems to emerge in each of these technology domains in the long term is a kind of category leading open source offering that develops a snowball effect, right? And there's always going to be other kind of options in any given space. There's other open source operating systems, other commercial operating systems still, as far as I understand. By harnessing kind of this interest in people building up here and wanting to work together on the bits that are common down here, we felt that needed to happen in this space too. I felt that needed to happen in this space. So that's what I've been working on, and we've created some really cool stuff. Really reinventing how digital identity can work. Happy to go into that. And I think it's a long play. I'm 4 years in, and I feel like there's still so much more to do. So it's kind of a killer job. The only problem is sometimes I'm asking people to pay me money for something they will already get for free anyways, right? I'm selling a relationship, I'm selling kind of the value in a club, and we do give them some value, like tickets to our events and things like that, but ultimately you kind of have to appeal to their sense of what's right for the long term, what's right for this thing they're building on top of, which is a commons, right? How do you contribute to that commons with money, but also with developers and that sort of thing? And that's a challenge, but I'd much rather be doing this than anything else right now.
Wow. So if you read about your bio, right, there's kind of a secondary track that you also have where you've been involved with Mozilla or the EFF. Can you tell us a bit more about how did that come into play? Mm-hmm.
So again, being on the internet in the early days, being inspired by things like the Declaration of the Independence of Cyberspace, which was John Perry Barlow's kind of declaration that he gave actually at Davos in 1996, which was basically this call to arms, we the citizens of cyberspace, put all of you on notice, the banks, the politicians. I can't remember it verbatim, but it's worth a read, partly for again, how quaint it looks. As it turns out, the internet does have real-world kind of landing spots, and there's every reason to believe that governments can and will enforce their will on those local kind of nodes. But also this sense of kind of mission, that we needed to have as pioneers in this space, as whether you're a technologist or you're just a settler on this frontier, in kind of declaring a sovereign space for this and declaring that we will reinvent these rules. The things that are broken about society today, we have a chance to reinvent, right? So that was inspirational. And as Apache grew, that was really where I spent, if my day job was organic and CollabNet and these other things, my night job was helping get the Apache Software Foundation off the ground. A few years after starting the web server project, it was being used by more than half the web. And, we had people telling us, if somebody finds that you're implementing something in their patented systems, right, or the patents that they own, they very reasonably would come to you and ask for $1 per running copy of Apache, right, or whatever. And we felt it would be kind of tragic to lose our life savings and homes for the crime of giving away free software. So that was one reason to start a nonprofit foundation around to kind of provide a protective shell to the developers working on this, to do the right thing in the eyes of the law if there was a situation like that, and to give us kind of protection. We're not at risk of losing our life savings. But then we realized that this was really kind of essential to taking this informal culture that we had developed on the Apache web servers list and kind of these side projects that were starting to emerge at Apache and kind of institutionalizing that, trying to create a repeatable template that could be used not only for more and more open source projects, but also help carry it forward. So none of us had to be, frankly, like Linus Torvalds, who has been working on the Linux kernel for 27 years now. I very happily was able to walk away from the Apache Software Foundation in 2003, 2004. Not because I had a big disagreement with them, but because I was ready to go do something else. And you can't do that if the project is entirely personality-based, right? If it's entirely about hinging on, the benevolent dictator for life, right? Who is a term used in a lot of open source projects, who keeps the community together through their diplomacy skills, but doesn't realize that part of that obligation is training the next generation or creating a structure, just enough process, not bureaucracy for bureaucracy's sake, but just enough process to be able to hand the reins off to somebody else and know that it can continue. And so so the ASF has grown and grown. It's still very, very big. I still follow what's going on inside it, but as an observer, and it's a wonderful experience. It's like watching, I don't have this experience yet because my daughter's 4.5, but it's got to be like what I would imagine it'll be like when I see her go off to college, and then start her own life and never call or anything like that. No, I'm kidding. But in the course of doing that, it was like there's this recognition that this open source concept needed people to champion it, but also people to help defend it. And so there was a meeting of a group of people around kind of defining the term open source. And out of that came a call to create another nonprofit called the Open Source Initiative that would qualify licenses as open source licenses. So I was there and I served on the board of the OSI for a while. And then when Netscape realized that they couldn't really compete with Microsoft on the web browser, actually it was Netscape's parent organization, AOL, who had bought Netscape as kind of a hedge for negotiating better terms with Microsoft on a number of deals. When they realized that was no longer the strategic asset that it should have been, and they were kind of basically ready to shut it down and send everyone home, the set of employees at Netscape who were really passionate about the fight for an open web, the fight for standards, the fight for a browser that would be an alternative that wouldn't just be. None of us wanted to hand the web to Microsoft, right? If there was any sort of like idealistic kind of like impossible kind of like notion, it was maybe we can keep the web from becoming as completely owned by one company as the desktop was. Because in 1998, Mac desktops were like, you guys, some of you might remember, like very, very much, I mean, you might see it at a few desktop publishing companies, graphics companies, whatever, but it was not what it is today in terms of usage out there. Pre-iPhone, it was like all about Windows and that, a lot of pressure just to design your website for IE and all that. So a bunch of really idealistic people at about 20 who were all about to be let go from Netscape as AOL was shutting that whole thing down said, why don't we open source this? Why don't we kind of take this out of AOL? So first they open sourced it, and then they set up a separate nonprofit called the Mozilla Foundation. And so I was one of the people outside that community, but still very supportive and on good terms with Mitchell Baker, who's still the chief lizard wrangler for Mozilla, and she's a force of nature. Just said, can you come on the board? And so I've tried to be on the board of that and on the board of Benetech, which is another nonprofit that does open source software, although I recently kind of left that just as I'm trying to pare some commitments down, and joined the board of the EFF in 2013, again, by invitation, but I believe so much in their mission, like a week after getting on the internet in 1991, found out about the EFF, because the EFF had started in 1990, and was like, well, thank God, here's the ACLU for this brand new domain. And this domain is going to be very different from a human rights perspective, from a freedom of speech perspective, from all this stuff than what we have today, and the fights they're fighting are fights that are going to be relevant in 20 years, and sure enough, they are. So none of those positions are paid. None of those are because I'm a big donor or anything like that. I'm not a big donor, but it's servant leadership, I guess. I mean, I'm on there to take the jobs like audit committee, right, or compensation committee, or things that are like kind of the drudge work, but basically that help those organizations function. And where they do need independent directors who can be kind of just a watchful eye, I don't view them as a place for me to push my agenda. It is helpful sometimes to like help them think about strategy and where to go and introductions, people they might want to work with, but it's always the staffs of those organizations that really are the ones who own the vision and the delivery of that. And it's just an honor to be able to be on those boards rather than a job or anything like that. It's fun. But it felt like an obligation to do that. And I've tried to also help, especially when I was at a VC firm, I felt like part of my job was to go and find startups and entrepreneurs and things like that and try to advise them and mentor them. I didn't have official mentorship relationships, just a lot of, hey, call me if you need anything types of things, and done a bit of that for other nonprofits as well. But yeah, that second kind of life. Sometimes it helped me feel better about my first life, insofar as there were times at CollabNet, at Organic, where it's like I'm building a website for who again? Or hey, I'm pitching the DoD to host, to be a customer of mine. All right, I'll do that so I can do this, right? And maybe that was moral equivalency. Maybe that's it's still a compromise, maybe. But I felt like if I can get the time and space and the funds to be able to do the stuff that's meaningful to me by doing a bit of the stuff that I have problems with or qualms with, as long as that isn't too evil, maybe that's okay. Maybe that's rationalizable. But these things were much more closely interrelated. Even when I was at the World Economic Forum, that was very much about my first and second life, kind of, colliding even. Yeah.
Okay, so I feel like I've asked a couple of great, kind of ground-setting questions. Does anyone else in the audience want to jump in and we can open up Q&A? Or else I can continue to ask questions.
And I want to say, this is I don't know a lot yet about Commons, but I know a little bit from talking with you and with Jacob and seeing some of the descriptions on the wall back there. This sounds like a great organization, and this sounds like the kind of thing where I've pivoted a number of times in my career, right? I've done things for a while and then said I need to do something else. And it's always hard to figure out what that next thing is. There are times when that move was like I was pulled away from something else just that was really compelling, kind of like the switch from working at a VC to working on Hyperledger. There are other times where I took a 9 months off, a year off, and even times when I did that and at the end of those 9 months still didn't have a clear idea what I wanted to do. But having that freedom to explore, to let your interests kind of line up with what you think you can make some money at doing is so essential. I think it's easy to get trapped in a rat race of and thinking there's a ladder to climb. Hopefully people can get to a stage early enough in their career where they're able to just get a little bit of earnings to give them the buffer to be able to have that luxury to go and do what they want to do. I've never had a big exit from any of the commercial stuff I've done, but I've had enough to be able to work on what I want to work on. I still need a job. I still need to show up and get a paycheck, right? But there's just enough buffer that I can if I get bored with something after a few years or whatever, I have the space to be able to figure out what to do next. And everybody should have that luxury. And everybody should have a structure like this. The thing that played the strongest role for me like this was something the World Economic Forum did called the Young Global Leaders Program. So I'm working at CollabNet, and I get this envelope in the mail. Congratulations, you've been nominated and accepted into the Young Global Leaders Program of the World Economic Forum. And I thought it was like spam. I thought it was like, all those, anybody still get like, you've been nominated for the Who's Who directory, just send $200 to, maybe that's an old thing. But actually, because they weren't asking me for money, I gave it a second look. I went and Google searched, World Economic, they do that Davos thing. Okay, so that's a legit organization. This appears to actually be an envelope from Switzerland. Okay, that would be expensive to do if it were a scam. Why not just show up at this thing and see what happens? And what I found was a community of people, they kind of pulled together people who had done something noteworthy, but were in their 30s or close to their 30s, maybe a bit out of their 30s in some cases, but people who could reasonably be expected to still have a lot more left in their career to do, right? And who were just young enough to be able to, I know it's a pompous name, Young Global Leaders. Once you get past that, it ended up being here are people who've done interesting things in science, done interesting things in finance, done interesting things like a young government minister of some sort, and people who are passionate, people who are driven by a sense that there's a problem worth solving out there in the world. Either they've chosen that problem to solve or they were looking for the next one given the skills that they had. And it was a great place to go in 2006, 2008, and talk to them about what open source was, which is how do you get communities of people with the same challenges, the same need, to actually work on common intellectual property together in a world where everybody is driven to get a patent, to build proprietary software, to build a website that locks your users in. How do you be constructive? And it resonated so strongly with something. So one of my mentors, again, I never had a formal mentor, somebody I saw a lot, but Tim O'Reilly of O'Reilly & Associates was somebody who, especially in the early days of CollabNet, kind of served as a mentor for me. And he had kind of two sayings that resonated. One was work on stuff that matters, right? Work on things that are going to have an impact, but that the impact is something that will be visible, something that will move the needle on some sort of injustice out there, something that's wrong, right? You can build a better ad server for a while, if you need to, but find a way, even if you're doing that, find a way to help nonprofits use that ad server to reach more people, right? And then the second thing he said was try to create more value than you capture, right? And it wasn't talking about stockholder or shareholder value or anything like that. It was somewhat about open source software, right? By fixing a bug or adding a feature to myself, it's trivial to contribute that upstream so that helps other people, right? That's a very elemental view of it. And it wasn't talking about, hey, I've launched a free website that I feed people ads with, but it's free. They get value too. That's a pretty self-serving view of value. Look at value as something that is truly a gift, truly something that increases autonomy or sovereignty or increases the wealth of the person who is receiving that, right? And so those two things have been kind of leading lights for me. And so finding that community, I just found myself talking about collaborative initiatives, collaborative software, collaborative IP, how we work together, and people, whether they were at for-profits or nonprofits, kind of turning on and realizing this isn't about communism. This isn't about death to shareholder value. This is about how do we move? In fact, there's an African proverb that says, if you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go together, right? And so this is tapping into stuff that wasn't invented by Linus Torvalds or Eric Raymond. This is tapping into stuff that goes back before the internet. And so it's a great environment to find that kind of resonance and be able to build friends with people I would have never expected to, right? And really feel a commitment to do. That was where I decided to volunteer on the Obama campaign in 2008, because it was early enough in that campaign. He was far from the presumed kind of nominee, but he was saying the right things about technology and the tool for it to kind of make government more accountable, make it more transparent, make it more fair, and that resonated strongly with me, and make it more collaborative with citizens, right? So I'm hoping that this place can serve as similar inspiration, and there are other places I see popping up in tech out there to do this kind of thing, but it is rare, it seems. It is rare, it seems.
Yeah. Jada.
How would you describe describe Hyperledger to, oh, sorry. How would you describe Hyperledger to like a cryptocurrency skeptic, right? Like if someone says Bitcoin and Ethereum are mostly pump and dump schemes for grandmothers and, wasting the world's energy and introducing, carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, like how is Hyperledger different? Or are those skeptics totally wrong? Like what's the pitch?
Thank you for allowing me to stop talking about myself, because I'm always nervous about talking about myself. Now I can talk about Hyperledger. So first off, Hyperledger is a collection of technologies. It's kind of like, and communities building those technologies. So it's comparable to Apache in that way, right? In that they're brought together under this common theme of distributed ledgers, smart contracts, kind of building blocks to be able to build decentralized, cooperative, multi-party systems, right? And somebody might say, well, you mean like a Google Doc? Do you just mean like multiple people being, or Git? In fact, Git is in some ways is kind of a distributed ledger. There's commits that happen, and so in a way, this is like Git for everything else. And it turns out with Git, you don't need a cryptocurrency to fund the consensus mechanism. It's enough to operate out of inherent self-interest of all the parties, right? Everyone wants a consistent Git history. If their Git history is corrupt, they'll resync with other people and get a new one. And when they push a commit upstream, parties accept it or not, right? Like there's a governance model there that makes sense. And likewise, since the rise of Bitcoin, Bitcoin kind of, you remember, it came out of the economic crisis of 2007. It came at a time when confidence in institutions and governance was collapsing. It's still pretty low. There's this thing called the Edelman Trust Barometer that for 25 years has been measuring how much do average people trust their banks, their lawyers, the government, brands like Coca-Cola, and it's all been like a 25-year decline. Like we have trouble trusting things anymore. And so Bitcoin was devised as a system that will allow us to come to a common consensus view of a system of record. In this case, like who owns which tokens out there, which keys own which tokens, in a way that doesn't require anybody to act outside of their own self-interest, and incentivizes everyone to work together. So I have a lot of respect and admiration for that kind of system. What I don't like is that it's based entirely on this consensus mechanism that burns CPU power as a proxy for voting power. Right? It presumes nobody in the world has all the compute power or the majority of the compute power, and so that's more relatively evenly distributed. Amazon has a lot, of course. Google has a lot, and so proof of work is their fairness mechanism. Well, we have a fairness mechanism in most governance organizations, which is one person, one vote, one organization, one vote, that sort of thing. And so the consensus mechanisms used in many of the projects at Hyperledger are not cryptocurrency driven. They are driven by that sense of organizational consensus, right? If all of us here are participants in a supply chain, then all of us are witnesses to a line of transactions happening, and we're confirming each other's transactions, we don't need anything more than the same kind of enlightened self-interest that drives a Git process or that sort of thing to make the system work. Now, there's lots of gray area there and lots of innovation happening both on the cryptocurrency and proof of work side, especially when it comes to privacy and confidentiality. And one thing I think they do have a good handle on is incentive design. I just don't think anyone's using incentive design very well just yet, but DeFi, decentralized finance, seems interesting. And so when I came into Hyperledger, it's like, it's going to be a complex future. It's a spectrum. This is not cryptocurrency versus not. There's a lot of points in between. And can Hyperledger usefully be a home for that full spectrum? And most importantly, like blockchain was pretty young in 2015, arguably 8 years since Satoshi published his paper, but it's definitely young on the enterprise side. And now being kind of old, I've seen these technology waves come, and you have this Cambrian explosion, followed by consolidation, to a kind of an ordinary state where you have a couple of leading engines to solve a given problem, and then everything moves up to another layer above. And I felt like blockchain technology was going to go through that life cycle. There'd be an explosion in different ways to build blockchain networks. I didn't think we'd ever converge on just one big network. It would always be kind of heterogeneous in that way. But at the very least, we could have lots of different networks, but have a few common technologies. And so the long-term picture for the role we've played, and I hope to really continue to play, is how do we help consolidate the industry? How do we help take what's useful and interesting in minor projects, invite them in and have those become add-ons and extra features to the other leading platforms, if that makes sense. And in the same way that Linux helped consolidate the Unix server space, we don't have, I guess there is still Solaris, but like, but all that stuff kind of consolidated to Linux.
So I have one quick follow-up, which is, as you mentioned, consolidation, right? When I think about Bitcoin, and I'm an amateur or whatever, but I think about, is it Bitfinex and Tether? I think about Coinbase. I think about the manufacturers of ASICs in China and large mining pools. Like there are some odd concentrations of power even in a distributed system, right? If like Antpool controls like a huge amount of stuff, or if right, like that maybe defeats the ideal view of a decentralized utopia, and in fact just on top of this technology, brings us into the world we already know.
I love utopians. I'm a utopian. Like, I still believe that like we're not going to get to a better society without technology. There's a lot of dystopians out there, people who feel less technology is going to be better, right? That we've got to have less technology, and I'm sympathize with them. I mean, in some ways, the Center for Humane Technologies, which we were, who was I talking with about that? Oh, right, Vishal. In some ways, they're a little bit like, are there dark patterns to these technologies we shouldn't be using anymore? Which is, but I'm still a utopian, right? And I think we won't make progress against the SDGs without tools to really help. But it's also kind of the bane of any successful innovator that when you build a thing, it's going to be used, if you're successful at it, if you've actually created something interesting and useful, it will be used by people you abhor for purposes you can't imagine, right? There are a whole lot of people who after the 2016 election had this Robert Oppenheimer moment. Robert Oppenheimer was one of the scientists who led the Manhattan Project, and at White Sands when they detonated the first test and it goes up, he had this moment which he told about later, where he said, "I have become Kali, destroyer of worlds," right? Which is a line from the Bhagavad Gita about a person who becomes God, basically, and ends up destroying everything. And I think lots of technologists in the internet and space had that feeling, like, have we over-connected ourselves? Have we allowed these wonderful tools that we've built on the presumption that better connectivity was an inherent good to be weaponized, right? And so I think Bitcoin and cyber utopians kind of came out of that, and it's no surprise to find that there are people out there interested in using these tools to for all sorts of scurrilous reasons, right? To try to mint money out of thin air and exit the scene as quickly as they can, right? And I don't know. I go back and forth between, is that a cost of doing business in this space, or is that an actual problem? I know it's enough of a problem that like even the word blockchain is kind of, we use distributed ledger technology, multi-party technology, but that's going to be a hard one to actually give up if I have to give it up. But really what drives me is not making banks, like 5% more efficient in how they like send wires from one bank to another. What wakes me up is the idea of using this technology to fight slave labor in the diamond trade, or overfishing, so a lot of the SDGs out there, who knows what the SDGs are? The Sustainable Development Goals. Okay, a few. So, for better or worse, like the international organization community has tried to define what's wrong in the world. They came up with 250 different metrics of what's wrong in the world. And they're actually a really good set. And they build on top of this earlier thing called the Millennium Development Goals, which arguably, at least they serve as a focusing and a framing for everybody in the social impact space to think about what are they going to try to fix, what are they going to try to solve, right? And the SDGs, there's no way we're going to make progress on them without being able to better work together as a society in doing things like you should be able to buy a diamond that you have high confidence didn't come from a slave labor mine in the Congo, that instead came from a certified mine in South Africa, right? How do you know that if you're taking the diamond company's word for it, right? In projects that use blockchain technology to trace these supply chains, you have basically everybody writing to this ledger when they receive it, when they hand it off to the next party, when they refine it. And the trust ends up being in the process rather than having to vest that trust in the individual, in the company, right? This is not a cryptocurrency use case. This has nothing to do with cryptocurrency, right? But that same kind of, how do we as a community come to a collective understanding of what the truth is, what is as it should be? Like that feels like a problem we're solving in a world where between, videos, what is it, the fake videos, what's the term for it? Deepfakes. Between deepfakes, between national firewalls, like it's really hard to know who we can trust anymore. And this is a technology to try to counter that. That's what motivates me. And if it happens to also allow JP Morgan and IBM to make a buck, great. Like, we should all be so lucky as to find a way to have a social impact that also threads the needle with something that gives us the sustainability to be able to fight that. But that won't always be there. I also am a supporter of the campaign to stop killer robots, and there is no business model that is a sustainability model for that. That is all about no, this is the right thing to do.
I was going to say, you were talking for a while about sustainability just now. At what point in history of the internet did you feel like open source finally became sustainable? And there's been interesting moments, like when Red Hat was acquired by IBM recently.
35 billion or something like that, or even GitHub by Microsoft. Although GitHub has a lot of proprietary software. They don't open source their infrastructure. And even with Red Hat, there's a lot of IP that they built that wasn't open sourced, right? Open source has always been a technique rather than a business model. And I say this kind of guiltily because I contributed a chapter to a book called Open Sources that was titled Open Source is a Business Model, and I've gone I got that wrong. It's a technique. It's for every business, there's always going to be a line where you build stuff kind of down here that is table stakes. That's about enabling you to go and have a business, right? It's non-differentiating. It's not special to who you are or how you're solving a problem. It's just, it's drudge work. And you'd much rather work on that with other people, split the load of that, than have to do it all yourself, right? And then there's stuff above that line that truly is differentiating. And I have no moral or philosophical kind of qualm about plenty of that being proprietary software. GitHub is fine, right? There's nothing dark about that. I think the way that GitHub kind of traps user identity, even though you can log in with GitHub elsewhere, they're not really participating in any decentralized identity stuff, not yet, hopefully soon, is a little bit more kind of like what I'd rather I saw them do. But open source has been a viable business technique, since even before it was called open source. Like Red Hat bought another company called Cygnus that was all about maintaining the GNU C compiler and charging companies a couple $100,000 to millions of dollars a year for that support and services, and all the code they wrote got upstreamed into open source software. So it's always been a viable technique. There is certainly, though, a feeling that shifted from it being the disruptive kind of rebel kind of, why would you do that, like not trustworthy kind of thing, and where that's now become kind of much more accepted and almost base state. Oh, you're doing something here, and if it's not open source, that's kind of a reason to be suspicious, right? And I think that shift happened when the Department of Defense in 2006, I want to say, issued like some sort of bulletin. I forget what they have a term for it, but like a bulletin to its procurement offices, which said you have to treat open source as COTS, common off-the-shelf software, right? Which meant that companies responding to RFPs from the DoD or even the DoD's internal teams were free to use Python, were free to use Perl, were free to use Apache, were free to use Linux, if they themselves either supported it or found people to support it for them. But until that point, you had at one point Microsoft executives going around calling open source cancer. You had others saying, don't let any of it in because it'll, the GPL will compel you to open source everything else that you build, right? Which is not true. There's a lot of FUD at that time, and when that came out, from that point forward, that FUD just didn't have an audience anymore. So that was cool to see.
All right. So you said you wanted to make it the Hyperledger kind of the Kubernetes of containers, and so Kubernetes was a right, exactly. So Kubernetes would, in my view of history, was kind of enabled by Linux container technology. Is there something like that? Why is this a Linux Foundation project? Is there something?
So the Linux Foundation has a lot of these collaborative projects. Some of them are directly related to Linux, like something called automotive grade Linux, which was initially all about how to help car companies use Linux inside and has become about entertainment systems and nav systems and all this other kind of stuff. And in fact, there's over 100 different collaborative initiatives within the LF, of which Hyperledger is one. And we're one of the larger ones, but those projects are not required to build on Linux or have any direct tie to Linux. They can be about software that only runs on Windows. I mean, there isn't anything I can think of that has that, but nor are we required to use Kubernetes, for example, right? You know, these are organizationally, and these are set up independently to make their own decisions about what technologies to use or not use. And that's the only credible way to do it, right? Partly because we don't pay people to write the software. I'm not directing the development. I'm an air traffic control operation. Or at best, a glorified weatherman. You know, like instead of telling you, well, Fabric 2.0 will have this feature, this feature, this feature, you know, because I'm taking ownership of it and I'm paying people to build that, I kind of have to say, well, the Fabric developers it looks like 2.0 will come in towards the end of the month. We think it'll have these features. We're there to kind of, you know, provide the grease and the gears to make that stuff work well. And hopefully, like the way I frame it for my staff is our job is to make sure that any hour or any dollar that a company or the developers are spending in improving this stuff or even using this stuff should be as optimal as possible, right? Like our job is to make the open source process work. But you know, it can be like if you throw a party, you find a good DJ, you put the food there, and if nobody comes in the door, it doesn't matter how well you did. So I try to not get too far ahead of my own community in terms of what I think should be built. It's entirely organic. That's the only source of our credibility in this space.
The time you spent at a VC firm kind of stuck out in the progression of your career. I was wondering if that was sort of something you saw as a way to pay the bills, or if you saw investing as maybe a point of leverage for some of these more ideological aims.
Yeah, so the venture capital firm I worked for was Mithril, and I decided to start working there. I'd left the World Economic Forum. I worked there for 2 years, and I moved back. I mean, I had always kind of kept my place in San Francisco, and I was living in Geneva, coming back, like 1 week here, 5 weeks there. But my heart was still here. I mean, literally, my girlfriend, who became my wife, was here, right? But also, I felt like living in Geneva, I was starting to lose the network of people that I had meant so much to me for the last 20 years. Partly that was technical, partly even social. But I really didn't feel like I wanted to live in Geneva for 10 years, right? So coming back, I did maintain a relationship with the WEF, and I'm still on really good terms. I am going to Davos in a few weeks. Like it's always try to leave a job on like the best note if you can, right? Like in my experience. But I wanted to do something different, and I did feel like that was an itch that I hadn't scratched yet. Was what would you like to be on the other side of that table? And I had no prior. I mean, I'd done a little bit of angel investing, which probably had an average success rate. Most of what I invested in did not succeed, but that's par for the course, right? But really, it was because I had a friend who was one of the founding partners of Mithril, who I'd always had good conversations with, and I figured even if I don't have a crystal clear notion of what I want to do next, this would be a good place to sit and see a parade of different ideas and companies come through and figure out what to do next. And it took 2.5 years, but then that's when I jumped into the blockchain stuff. And that, for me, is much more personal. Being at a VC firm, I mean, you talk to people about it. Sometimes they love it. That's how their brain works. Sometimes it's a real struggle for them. It was a struggle for me. And there were certainly companies I brought in from my network and presented that I thought were great investment candidates. And I think actually that had probably a better, I mean, I haven't sat there and gone, what's my ghost portfolio? If only they'd invested in the things that I said they should have invested in, what would have been my return? And how would it, I can't say I did that. Plus, you never know, right? Like different things play out. But I think I did a pretty decent job of sourcing them. I just never figured out how to make the case to the other partners, right? And that was kind of frustrating. And I do think sometimes there's a lot of a lot of advantage to the VCs who play more hardball with startups and get better deals for themselves than I was comfortable doing. But I wanted to at least have the experience on that side, so I understood that mentality, I think. And I did get to meet a lot of terrific startups. It was unusual, and I certainly had a lot of friends go, huh? Because it did look like I was joining the dark side of the force, for sure. But the world is more complex than that, right? And I wanted to kind of understand that. And yeah, frankly, like I could use another kind of like bump in net worth. Didn't come that way, but at least not yet. I mean, like some of this stuff takes 10, 15 years to actually turn into returns. So maybe someday it will. But yeah, I was glad that I did it, but I'm really glad I didn't spend more than 2.5 years there.
Do you have a quick follow-up? I think we're pretty close. Sorry, on a related note, do you think that like crypto crowdfunding could make investing more competitive and therefore less adversarial for entrepreneurs?
Just so the other folks can hear it, because I don't think that's amplified. Do I think crypto crowdfunding can make venture investment more, investment in startups more equitable, more fair? Is that a way of putting it? Yeah. I don't know. I mean, what startups need is not just money. They need a network to tap into that. That's what a good venture partner is supposed to bring. They should bring, here's other companies we work with you should be talking to, here's big customers who we think have a need. Like, they should be more active. That's the only way to make their money worth it, frankly. A bad VC firm is one that just signs a check and goes in on a party round. And I think, and I do see some early stage companies, whether it's through ICOs and that kind of thing, or otherwise take a whole lot of money and then discover they have 100 people who put in $5,000 a piece and now expect to be able to have a 1-hour conversation with you a week, right? Because they're an investor, right? And you're a startup and you should be begging for their attention. So in both directions, I don't think it's a great idea. But look, it might work for some. Yeah. Do we have time? Sorry. Okay. And you were raising your hand too, right? Oh, okay.
You already mentioned the World Economic Forum a couple of times, and as an organization on that end with strong access to enterprises, to governments, to other powerful organizations. How did that go with your passion for, in that sense, open source in the context of your, I guess, agenda as the CTO for the WEF, especially as maybe a lot of the stakeholders that you work with, at least on a higher level, for them, they don't necessarily think about open source or maybe even open source, closed source. They just have a different agenda. And how did you bring that together at the end of the day?
Yeah, so the World Economic Forum is also one of those organizations that, like Mithril, might have sounded like I was going to join the dark side of the force, right? Because it is an organization where the outside impression is, well, that's where the fat cats and the corporate leaders go to decide at the beginning of the year how to divide the spoils of capitalism amongst themselves for the remainder of the year, right? And it was started by a guy named Klaus Schwab, who did his economics PhD at Berkeley. He's a German, economics kind of professor kind of guy, but he did his economics PhD at Berkeley in 1971. Kind of just after the height of the free speech movement in Berkeley. And his thesis was on stakeholder capitalism, basically an evolution of shareholder value theory of capitalism to say, maybe as a business you should take into account the decisions of everybody, or the opinions and viewpoints of everybody who will be affected by your decision, not just the interest of your shareholders in every decision that you make. And if you do that, you will likely end up with a better financial outcome for your shareholders anyways, right? And it was kind of the beginning of, call it double bottom line thinking, call it social business kind of thinking. I don't think he gets enough credit for that. He's kind of, in some ways, he makes sure he gets credit for things. But that thesis was strong enough that he started to make a lot of friends with people in Europe, in both the government communities and in the labor unions and leaders. And in the early 70s, Europe was basically falling apart in the strife between larger businesses and state-owned businesses and labor unions, and lots of stuff shutting down. Germany was not reunified yet at that point. Poland was in a death spiral. There was bad shit going on. And he said, I have an idea. Why don't we go up to this Swiss ski resort I know of, and we'll go skiing in the morning, and in the afternoons over schnapps, we'll talk about the state of the world and how to improve it, right? And that worked, and it was 30, 40 people, and then the next year it was 100 people, and he was like, why don't we invite this religious leader? Why don't we invite this other kind of a couple business owners? And that was the birth of the World Economic Forum's Davos events. And so you could even tell as an outsider, as a YGL, that it was actually a pretty utopian and optimistic organization, right? And everybody who was a staffer that I met was in their 20s and 30s. And this was like, these were people who, I mean, the mission of the organization was committed to improving the state of the world, right? And whether you, I mean, you can be cynical about that. You can even be cynical inside and say, well, if by every metric the world is not improving, are we being successful at all at what we do? But that mission alone and the concept that you can talk a lot publicly about what's wrong in the world, but if you get people to work together privately, if you can get like the head of Pepsi and the head of a water quality nonprofit and an environmentalist and the head of like an Indian government agency to sit in a room privately, have an honest conversation, and then collectively come out of that with a proposal to do a Pepsi bottling plant in India that uses recycled water, something like that, and allow them all to take credit for that idea. Maybe you get past the wars that people have out there, like kind of the semantic battles people have over what's actually going to solve the world, right? So that appealed to me, and right when I was looking for the next thing to do after being in government, it was like helping that organization figure out how to use digital technologies. Well, first off, use things like social networking and not Facebook, because I didn't want to have that kind of phenomenon happen on a trapped network, but to happen in a network that the WEF could build, basically do a Facebook for the WEF. That's kind of what I went in there to build. They had the beginnings of that kind of thing, and I kind of massively rebooted that. I can't say I succeeded in building a Facebook for the WEF, but what they have now is a lot better than that and is used by a lot of those kinds of people, and is a core part of the events that they put on now. I got to spend about half my time, well, maybe 25% of my time doing that, 25% of my time getting more digital thinking into other parts of the agenda that they did there. Things that you now see in this thing called the Center for the Fourth Industrial Revolution, which is actually has a base here in San Francisco. And digital concepts now permeate almost every initiative that the WEF does. And then the other 50% of my time getting the WEF off of a very old and broken Lotus Notes implementation. Because I came in as essentially a CTO, but to get agency and get the authority to do some of what I wanted to do, I had to kind of basically come in as CIO as well. So I had a staff of 40 and the budget reporting to me and that sort of thing. So that's what I did there, and I did that for 2 years and pushed a lot of things. Sometimes you feel like you're just nudging, an oil tanker slightly, like to 1 degree that way. Other times you see it, and other times I saw the results of my work years after I left, right? And then in terms of access to the people who showed up, I never really took a lot of opportunity. I was never like, oh, I've got to go meet with Angela Merkel or anything like that. I had that kind of access. Like I did end up meeting a lot of people like that, but I didn't see, it certainly wasn't my role as a staffer, as a Blue Badger, to be pushing my agenda onto the people who attended. But what I hoped to engineer by doing those jobs I mentioned was to get them thinking about these longer term pictures. And yes, I did mention open source software a lot, and I did make sure when we were spending money on technology, it was like pushing upstream as much as possible into open technologies. And I left that being pretty happy with that work. But the world isn't that much better today, if at all, than it was back then. Hopefully it's just less worse. Less worse than it otherwise would have been. And I think we're probably at time.
I think we're at time. So thank you so much for coming in and sharing your experiences with us.
My pleasure.
So I think we'll all hang out a bit for those of us who have time, and otherwise, thank you all for attending.
Thank you.